Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production YouTube, and welcome to episode number 2 of From the Mausoleum, where I take requested albums that do not fit as a part of the Album of the Week series. Yes, that is pretty much a pretty good slogan for this series here, From the Mausoleum. So, since episode number 1 was a request from Paul of Doomsay's Records, well, this episode is pretty much the same. Just that the difference is this one was given to me physically instead of digitally. And that is right here is the debut and only full-length album from this obscure Pennsylvania-based thrash metal band Graphic Violence, which was released back in 1997 through the Belgium label Conspiracy Records. So, and of course it was produced by Carl Kennedy, who produced plenty of classics from like Anthrax to Overkill and Possessed, and even TT Quick. So without further ado, let me get into my overall thoughts on the self-titled debut and only album from Graphic Violence. So, before I really get into my overall thoughts on the self-titled album from Graphic Violence, you know what I have to do? I have to do a track listing rundown so I can tell you folks what the songs were on this album, how many songs were on this album, and what's the time length for this album. And since technically there's at least 9 songs here, but if you own the CD here, it at least goes to 10 tracks, and that's because of there's a 49-second untitled track, which is basically more like an outro. So, there's that. However, according to Metal Archives, it at least states that this clocks in at 37 minutes, but for the CD here, since again, having it actually clocks in at the length of 40 minutes and 11 seconds. And that's not even because of the untitled track, because of if you even basically highlight all the 9 tracks, the time length actually goes to 39 minutes. So once again, the people at Metal Archives are off by 2 minutes with this one, or 3 minutes. So there we go. Now, these, of course, 9 tracks are beginning with the track Evil, which is not a Slayer nor a Merciful Fate cover, The Plague, Kill Again, which is not a Slayer cover, Future Days, Eroticide, The Pit, Solitude, Out of Control, and then ending with the track that's pretty much named after the band themselves, that is Graphic Violence. So there you go, folks, there's your 9 tracks. Now, for those that are definitely not familiar with Graphic Violence, they actually are based out of Scranton, Pennsylvania, and it's not quite certain when they were formed. However, again, on the back of the CD, which is kind of something because of whenever I see a CD here or anything or any sort of album that where the band will give out their P.O. box address and everything, that kind of gives you a little bit of a private press feeling in a way. It's very old school in that way too. It's very old school. But on here, apparently the P.O. box address is apparently credited to Carbondale, Pennsylvania. Now, I don't know if that is the address for one of the band members in the band. Because again, just because of a band is based out of such and such city doesn't mean that all the rest of the members in the band are actually based out of there. They could be living there, but at the same time, it could, since this is by the 90s, it could very well be somewhat different. So they probably have at least different addresses in different parts of Pennsylvania. And at least one of the members probably at least maybe put it out there to the band, say like, all right, we'll instead have the address go to my place instead of yours or whatever. It could be the address to maybe one of the founding members of the band, even though that's even kind of convoluted by which time frame these guys were even, when guys like Vince Ferrone, Dave Chedrick, and Butch Frabel were in the band at this point, because of, according to the Metal Archives, it says that they had recorded a demo in 1992 or 93-ish. However, most of the band members like Vince Ferrone, Dave Chedrick, and Butch Frabel, apparently they ended up being, their year dates says like 95. So it's kind of a little bit convoluted there and very unknown. But I'm not going to try and spend too much time on when, or making a lot of guessing games and when this band was probably formed in, or when these guys might have been in the band, or maybe that there could be a little bit of a mistake here. But again, there's no lot of interviews with these band members, so maybe at some point, since Paul had sent this to me, he could be working on an interview with probably like either Tabe Chedrick or Butch Frabel or Vince Ferrone for one of his fanzines, or magazines, whatever, to conduct an interview so I can actually get a really good information and good look into when graphic violence was really formed in, and if some of this information is either correct or incorrect. So that's all I'm going to go there. So there you go. Now, let's definitely focus on their actual full-length album, which is right now the only thing that's very much known for being official, because again, I have it in my hands and it's listed on Metal Archive, so there you go. Now, all I'm going to say is that before I had received my package from Paul of Doomsday Records, I only vaguely remember the cover art and everything for this album, because on Discogs, I would be searching up Carl Kennedy's Discogs page. I'd be looking on there just to see what other albums he's probably produced, And again, it all lists the obvious ones, the more known ones. But then there's something like this from Graphic Violence. Artwork looks pretty cool. It looks a bit more classic, more old school. But again, it's not a very easy album to come by. So, in a way, I really don't know whether or not how good this album is going to be, since it's being, listed as thrash metal. By 1997, what possibly was getting tagged as thrash metal might have been considered, in a way, metalcore. Because again, this is by the 90s. There wasn't a whole lot of known, newer, thrash metal bands that was playing that sort of classic brand of thrash metal that was very popular from the mid to late 80s and maybe early 90s, the classic stuff. Not like these days where it's a lot more easier to come across a lot more like, bands that really play that classic brand of thrash metal, like Vulture or a lot of other great bands that I can think, like even just... There's so many right now, and right now I don't want to look like too much of an ass because of certain band names are not coming to my mind right now. They are escaping me, but the only one I can just mention is Vulture. In a way, I do consider them more of a thrash metal band than really just a straight up speed metal band, especially their second record. But that's where I'm kind of basing my use an example as, besides in the 2000s, the mid ones, you had a lot of the retro thrash metal bands like Toxic Holocaust and Merciless Death and Fueled by Fire and Bonded by Blood and all these other bands, and Vindicator, Warbringer, who are all coming out of the woodwork, So there you go. There's some more better examples too. But in the late 90s, it was a lot more difficult. So when finally able to actually check this album out, boy, I can tell you I was definitely somewhat taken by surprise, but by how much I was going to enjoy this one, because I'll tell you this, out of all the albums that, Paul sent me, first there's some really cool ones anyways. I'm going to review one of those this week as well, but I'll tell you this, and be really honest, the Graphic Violence here ended up being my favorite of the lot, because this right here, not only is this really playing to that sort of, or really going for that sort of classic thrash metal sound in the mid to late 80s, but with Carl Kennedy behind the producer's chair and the way he mixes this, he's not mixing this like he's probably doing like a Possessed or an Overkill. A little bit maybe Overkill, I get a little bit of that, or like the Anthrax, but he's somehow able to give this such a raw, very primitive, and more Private Press feeling. Like if you've ever been very familiar with checking out a lot of Private Press metal albums from the mid to late 80s, especially when it comes to thrash metal department, you know how much more raw they tend to sound, especially those on like the Metal Storm and the Metal Storm and Ironworks label, in a way, that which is all under that same umbrella, ran by the same guy that ran that label, like Dark Angel and plenty of those great other bands too that was on that Overkill once too. So even at times I get a little bit of a little bit of a remembering, or I get just even a little bit of vibe, whatever, from like even the primitive days of Metal Blade. So it's all kind of there. And that's one thing that I've somewhat ended up really kind of gravitating towards with this album, is that it really kind of goes for a more underground, more obscure sort of sound, and doesn't try to sound anything more bigger than it should be, you know. It's not completely pristine in its mixing or production. It sounds way that I think it should sound, especially when you look at the artwork for this album. It actually lives up to its artwork in a way. I mean, the logo's kind of, yes, it's 90s-ish to an extent. It's not like classic sort of 80s thrash metal or metal, you know, logo-wise, you know, font. But it's still, it just has that sort of private press feeling to it, and that's where I think the music ends up kind of represents, is that sort of private press era. And to me, this sounds a lot like something that would have been great on like the Ironworks and Metalworks sort of label. It's got that feel. In a way, their sound, it's definitely thrashier. It's a lot heavier. You definitely can get the more extreme vibe in some of these songs. For example, like the song Evil and maybe The Plague or Kill Again or Future Days, whatever. Songs that where Dave Chedrick is kind of using a little bit more blast beats a bit on some of these songs. Again, probably taking some inspiration from the more extreme thrash metal bands and maybe primitive or early sort of death metal bands. But it's still straight up thrash metal. And on the doomy side, that's where I kind of tend to get a lot of that Metal Storm sort of feel and atmosphere. It plays around with some more doomier aspects to something where I get a lot of those kind of bands, where the more private press thrash metal bands, some of them were known for kind of throwing a little bit more doomier aspects, especially even those that were also signed to Metal Blade during the primitive days of Metal Blade, the infancy. And that's what I get from it. Like even like Nasty Savage were known for kind of using a lot of those doomier vibes, and that's what I get. To me, Graphic Violence are somewhat of a combination between Overkill, Blessed Death, which is actually more of a band that was actually signed to Megaforce, especially for their first album, Kill or Be Killed. I think that too was also produced by Carl Kennedy, if I am correct, as well. I get a bit of that. I do get a little bit of Nasty Savage in a way. So it's like a combination of the three, and it just comes across as so well put together. It is very raw. It's definitely not supposed to be the most pristine or primitive, but it's not trying to be fast for fast's sake like certain songs. It really kind of goes up and down, you know, in a way. It kind of has a very nice sort of build and pace in the way that you expect from a great thrash metal album to be like. And to me, this is definitely a great thrash metal album for this period in the late 90s. And that's the only thing that really kind of blew me away from this, is just how more primitive and more old school this really goes for. It doesn't sound like something that from like at least that 90s period to an extent. It's like it's trying to really go for more raw, more primitive, which again, I know I've been overusing that word, but it just has a very similar aspect going on that to me kind of elevates this album. It's the right sort of blend, and it's the right pacing and everything. It's just everything about the sound just feels right for me. Just great. Vince Ferrone's vocals, he definitely come across as very sort of old school to his approach. The way his vocals are mixed though are definitely raw. They're definitely kind of more spaced out or something, you know, it's like double in a way. But it just adds to the rawness of this album and the feralness, and it's why I think I've come to really enjoy this. It is such a... It just sounds like a long-lost thrash metal album from the 1980s, and during a time frame where it was a lot more difficult to come across stuff like this. You really had to do a lot of searching in the 90s. Even during the early days of the internet, this still was probably seen as very difficult to come by unless you know those who are in the know of stuff that was either coming out of the country, like in Germany, like with like Guillotine, whatever, you know. I was trying to still go for that sort of Sodom or Creator style of thrash metal. So you really had to really do a lot more deeper digging in order to kind of come across gems like this. And so really, just at the end of the day, if you're just one of those who's ran through their classic thrash metal collection that was on like Metal Blade Records, the Combat, to even the Megaforce label and Roadrunner, and let's say even like the Under One Flag label in Europe and in Britain, you're just going through all these classic ones, especially even let's say on like going through like the Metal Storm label or the Ironworks, or you're just going through all your like old school Dark Angel albums and even the Overkill EP and just such and such. You're going through all of them. So you're just looking for, or even let's say on the Noise Records label, you're still trying to find more other good thrash metal, but yet still, even though it's more European, you're still trying to get that fix. But you still want to fix that sort of Americanized, sort of raw, sort of thrash metal that at least has those remnants of at least the classic sort of underground days of like Combat and Metal Blade and Megaforce and Metal Storm and Ironworks. You're looking for that classic. Once again, this is where I'm going to pin you to like Graphic Violence, which is probably the one album you should be searching out for. Right now, it has only been released on CD. It's been out of print for years, and it's never been given a actual vinyl record pressing. So at this point, it is very ripe for a reissue. It is ripe for one, and I definitely think that at this point, since you might be very curious in this one, you're probably going to be hooking up at least the guys over at Dive Bomb Records or Storm Spell to possibly look into reissuing this album and putting it back in print. Because to me, those are the only two labels I can think of where this album would be perfect to be a part of any of their slew or discography, full of albums that they're already reissuing, like the Primal Scream album, Volume 1, and Aragon album, whatever, too, that they had reissued with Dive Bomb. It's, again, similar. It would be, it's so, it just makes sense for an album like this to actually get reissued under that label. So hopefully somebody at least spams their email with trying to like, hey, reissue this Graphic Violence album. It's very good. Hopefully one of the guys of Graphic Violence, like Dave Chedrick, who of course these days has been at back in 2017, he actually toured with Raven again in a way to kind of fill in for like Joe Hasselvander, in a way it's probably seen as a transition from Joe Hasselvander to like who they have now, Mike Keller. And, of course, he's now been playing with Manowar Live. So there you go. So hopefully he's got some ties with, like, Dive Bomb or Storm Spell and might think about putting this album back in print. Because I think it deserves to. It's not very easy to come by. People are going to ask $30, $40 for it. You might see on Discogs where it might be listed for $25 or $28, but with shipping and everything, it's going to cost you about $35 or $32. So it's not very easy to get a hold of, and I'm lucky that somebody sent this to me for free in a way, because I don't know whether or not I would have come across this out in the wild. So there you go, and I'm glad that this was brought to my attention, and I'm glad I was turned on to another really cool sort of thrash metal album, and so there you go. So that's it. Those are my overall thoughts on the Graphic Violence album right here. Again, there's a lot of great freaking tracks on here to begin with. Again, that sort of doomier vibes on songs like in the beginning, or the middle section actually, of Evil and Kill Again and Solitude and everything. It's all great. There's some great fucking stuff on here. So I definitely recommend Graphic Violence. It's a pretty solid, obscure thrash metal album from the late 90s during a period when this stuff was not very easy to come by and it wasn't so widely promoted. Everything was all metalcore, new metal, and anything alternative during this period. But this right here was, again, would have been seen as a gem if somebody that was more into that old school style of metal from the 1980s that was more raw, more primitive, and heavy, that this would have been seen as a gem. And these days might still be a gem, since there's still plenty of great thrash metal bands coming out of the woodwork that are brand new. So there you go. I hope all of you enjoyed this one. So if you have any thoughts in it at all, if you've ever listened to this album, again, leave them in the comment section below, whether it be positive or negative. You can leave them. So with that, I hope all of you enjoyed. Thank you to Paul of Doomsday Records for sending this out to me. I really appreciated it. I ended up really digging this one quite a bit. So with that, I hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out. And I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.